The Gulf of Mexico does not care what time it is. It just moves black and slow and heavy, the kind of water that swallows sound. No lights on the horizon, except the ones belonging to the ship, and those were the kind of lights that were never meant to be seen from shore. The vessel was registered under a shell company out of Delaware. 3 layers of paperwork separated it from Vought International, which was exactly how Vought liked things. The crew knew to keep their heads down and their radios off after midnight. The cargo in the lower decks was not cargo anyone was meant to think about too hard, and the men with guns stationed at every stairwell were paid well enough to stop thinking entirely. On the main deck, a security supervisor named Garrett walked his usual circuit boots loud against the wet steel. He had done this job for 11 months. He had learned over those 11 months to feel nothing in particular about what was below him. He was on his 3rd lap when he noticed the piece of meat. Specifically, an entire rack of ribs stripped nearly clean sitting in the middle of the walkway, like someone had left it there as a joke. Garrett stopped. He looked at it. He looked at the door to the kitchen, which was 20 feet away and very much closed. He pulled out his radio. Before he could key it, something hit him in the back of the head. Not hard enough to break anything. Just hard enough to sit him down very suddenly on the deck with his ears ringing. "Sorry," said a voice above him. "Didn't see you." Garrett looked up. Standing over him was a young man who could not have been more than 19 years old. Lean, dark-haired, wearing a battered straw hat and a red cardigan that was open at the chest and doing very little against the ocean wind. There was a scar on his chest. 2 crossed lines, old and deep, visible even in the dim light. He had a chicken leg in one hand and was eating it with the complete focus of someone who had not thought about anything else for the past several hours. "Who the hell are you?" Garrett managed. The young man looked at him, then at the chicken leg, then back at him. "Is there more of this?" "What? More chicken?" "I found the cold storage, but there wasn't much left. I ate most of it." He said this without any apparent guilt. "The beef was better. You had a lot of beef." Garrett's hand found his radio. "Security to deck 3. "Oh, that's not going to work." The young man sat down cross-legged on the deck next to him, still eating. "I already talked to the guys downstairs. They're sleeping." He said sleeping the same way someone might say napping or taking a break with no particular weight on it. Garrett stared at him. Then he stared at the 4 men who were supposed to be guarding the stairwell access, who were now, in fact, very much lying on the deck in a pile approximately 15 feet away. "What did you do to them?" "Nothing bad. They shot at me first." The young man considered the chicken bone, decided it was done, and tossed it over the railing. "Your food is pretty good." The chef was angry, but I think he understood. The radio crackled. More voices distant coming from the upper decks. Footsteps coordinated. Someone had noticed the guards were down. Garrett got to his feet slowly, keeping his hands visible running through his options. The young man did not seem concerned. He was scanning the deck with the expression of someone calculating whether there was more food somewhere he hadn't checked yet. "You need to tell me who sent you," Garrett said. The young man looked at him. His eyes were dark and very direct and contained absolutely nothing that resembled calculation or threat or the cold, professional blankness that Garrett associated with people who boarded ships uninvited. He just looked like a dog that had heard its name called and wasn't sure if it meant something good or bad. "Nobody sent me," he said. "I was hungry." 6 armed men came through the upper hatch at a run. What happened next was difficult to explain in sequence, because it did not happen in sequence. The young man was on his feet before Garrett had fully registered the sound of the hatch opening. His left arm stretched, and Garrett's brain refused that image. refused it completely because arms did not do that. They did not extend 8 feet across a deck and grab a gun barrel and yank it sideways while the body stayed standing perfectly still 20 feet away. But that was what happened. The arms snapped back. The man holding the gun stumbled forward into his own teammate. "Gomu gomu no pistol." The words were said quietly, almost to himself. And then his right fist came forward in a straight line that covered the distance between them so fast that Garrett didn't see it move. Only heard the result a sound like a car door slamming, and 2 of the 6 men sat down very hard and did not immediately get up again. The remaining 4 spread out, which was tactically reasonable and also completely useless. The young man bounced on the balls of his feet, head tilting, tracking all 4 of them with the same easy attention he'd given the chicken leg. One of them went for a taser. His arm shot sideways, wrapped around the man's wrist from 6 feet out, and the taser clattered across the deck. Another tried to flank from the left. The young man pivoted without looking, and one foot came up in a short arc that caught the flanker under the chin. The last 2 stopped. He looked at them relaxed, hands sitting crooked from the movement. "Are there more of you?" he asked. Not threatening, just asking. They ran. Garrett had not moved. His back was against the railing, and his radio was in his hand, and he was genuinely unsure what he had just watched. The young man stretched his arms above his head, rolled his neck, and then paused. His attention caught on something Garrett hadn't noticed, a sound low and rhythmic coming up through the deck plating. Not machinery. Something else. The young man looked down at the deck, then at Garrett. "Is there another kitchen below?" "What? Another kitchen? I didn't check all the floors." He said this with genuine hope, like a man who had just remembered a door he hadn't tried yet. "There's no kitchen below," Garrett said. "Then what's down there?" "Storage." "What kind?" Garrett said nothing. He had told himself 11 months running that the answer to that question was not his business. He told himself that now, and it came out hollow, in a way it hadn't before, maybe because the person asking it had no agenda behind it, no threat, no leverage. Just a question sitting there too simple to dodge cleanly. He should have called for backup. He should have put distance between himself and this situation, and everything below the waterline of this ship. Instead, he followed the stranger down the stairwell, because if this kid opened those doors and saw what was there, Garrett needed to be the one who knew about it. Whatever Vought did with that information, later at least he'd be the one holding it. That was what he told himself. It was not entirely a lie. The lower deck smelled like disinfectant over something older and worse. The corridor was narrow, lit by buzzing fluorescents that had never been replaced on schedule, and the doors lining it were steel with number placards and no windows. Not refrigeration doors, not cargo locks, the kind with bolt latches on the outside. The young man walked slowly now. His earlier energy had gone somewhere quieter. He stopped at one door, listened. Then he pulled the bolt. Inside, 7 people. Adults, 2 of them, and 5 who were not. The children ranged from maybe 8 to maybe 13, and all of them were chained wrist to wall with just enough slack to sit or stand. They flinched back from the light. One of the adults, a woman with a cut above her eyebrow that had been left to close on its own, looked at the doorway and then at the figure standing in it, and did not seem to know what expression to make. The stranger stood there for a moment. He looked at the chains. He looked at the children. He looked at the bolt latches on the outside of the door, the ones that could only be operated from out here in the corridor by someone who was not inside the room. "Why are people in here?" he said. His voice had not changed yet. It was still the same flat, open curiosity he'd used asking about chicken. The woman opened her mouth, then closed it. One of the children made a small sound. "Are they locked in?" he asked. "Yes," the woman said. He looked at the chains again. Something moved through his face, not quickly, not dramatically. Just a slow settling like water finding its level. When it finished, he was not the same person who had been asking about kitchens 2 minutes ago. "Who did this?" he said. His voice was different now. Not loud. Not the hot kind of angry anger implied heat and urgency, and this was quieter than that. It was the voice of someone who had just pointed at a thing and made a decision about it the same way you'd decide to move something out of the road. The woman shook her head slowly. "Vought," she said. The word tasted like old metal. "We saw something. They said we'd be handled. Offshore." Behind the young man, Garrett had appeared in the corridor. He had followed all the way down. He did not say anything. The young man stepped into the room. He crouched in front of the nearest child, a boy maybe 10, sitting with his back against the wall and his chained hands in his lap. The boy did not move. The young man looked at the chain, then gripped it with one hand and pulled. The bolt came out of the wall in a spray of concrete dust, and the chain fell loose. He moved to the next one. "Stop," Garrett said. His voice cracked slightly. "You don't understand what you're—" "I understand fine." The young man did not look up. He was on the third chain. Someone locked children to a wall because they saw something. That's what I understand. If you take them off this ship, Vought will. I know. Fourth chain. Where's the upper deck hatch that opens to the water side? Nobody answered. He looked up at Garrett. Just looked with those direct, uncomplicated eyes. Garrett told him. Getting 7 people up 2 flights of stairs and across a deck that had now attracted the attention of every remaining guard on the ship took 11 minutes. 11 minutes that involved considerably more of the arm extension and the short explosive sounds of impact, and at one point, the young man picking up an entire security checkpoint booth, a small booth bolted down metal housing, one very surprised guard, and moving it to the side of the corridor with the same casual effort one might apply to a heavy suitcase. The Zodiac inflatable tied to the port side access ladder had been put there for executive evacuation purposes. It was good quality and fully fueled. The young man lowered the woman with the head wound first, then the children, one by one, handing them down like they weighed nothing, which for him they appeared to. The last child, the boy from the first cell, stopped at the top of the ladder and looked back at the young man. "Are you coming?" the boy asked. "In a minute." He glanced back toward the ship. Something in his expression shifted, calculating briefly, and then settling. "Go with them. Tell them to go east." The boy went down. The young man looked at the ship. There were sounds of reorganization inside radio chatter boots on steel. The particular controlled panic of a security force trying to establish what had gone wrong and where. He tilted his head. There were more hatches he hadn't opened. More corridors below him that he hadn't walked. He'd felt the vibration of them through the floor when he was down there. Different weight, different resistance behind those doors. The ship was longer than he'd had time for. He stood there an extra 3 seconds, hat pushed back, looking at the hull. Then he grabbed the anchor chain with one hand, swung himself down to the waterline in a single arc, and landed in the Zodiac without rocking it. The woman was already holding the tiller. He settled into the bow and immediately started checking the storage compartment built into the inflatable's hull. A small hatch, mostly first aid supplies, a flare gun, a sealed packet of emergency rations. He opened the rations. They were not good. He ate them anyway in approximately 4 seconds while the woman stared at him. "East," he said, pointing, still chewing. She opened the throttle without a word, and the black gulf swallowed them quickly enough that the ship's running lights were just yellow smudges by the time any of the guards reached the railing to look. Behind them on the lower decks, 3 of the hatches were still bolted from the outside. Whatever Vought had stored there, more people files that weren't meant to surface something else that moved better in international waters than on land, stayed where it was. The ship's crew would spend the next 4 hours trying to account for what had happened. And in the process, they would find things they were not supposed to find, and they would have to decide what to do about that. Most of them would make the wrong choice. Some of them wouldn't. That part was not his problem. He had done what he'd seen needed doing. The young man sat in the bow as the Zodiac cut through the chopped straw hat, tilted against the wind, emergency ration wrapper already somewhere at the bottom of the Gulf. His stomach was making its opinion known. The rations had been roughly equivalent to nothing. The woman beside the tiller watched him sideways. She had been watching him since the corridor. "What are you?" she asked finally. He looked at her. The question didn't seem to bother him. "Hungry?" he said. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, because there was nothing reasonable to do with that answer, she turned her eyes back to the water and kept the throttle open, and they ran for the coast in the dark. The Louisiana coast came up gray and flat in the early morning, smelling of diesel and wet grass and something fried that had been carried a long way on the wind. The Zodiac scraped onto a muddy bank somewhere south of a 2-lane road, and the woman with the cut above her eyebrow killed the engine and sat very still for a moment, like she was waiting for something bad to happen. Nothing did. The children were already asleep against each other in the stern. The kind of dead sleep that comes after the body decides it has processed enough for one night. The other adult, a heavy-set man named Curtis, who had not said more than 11 words since the lower deck, climbed out first and stood in the shallows with his hands at his sides, looking at the tree line like he wasn't sure it was real. The figure in the straw hat vaulted the bow without touching the inflatable's sides and landed on the bank in a crouch, straightened up and immediately scanned inland. The road, the direction of it, the way the wind was carrying something warm and greasy from somewhere to the left. "Is there food that way?" he asked. The woman stared at him. "We need to find somewhere safe. We need to contact someone. We need..." Right. He was already moving toward the road. "But is there food?" She watched him go. She looked at Curtis. Curtis looked back at her. Neither of them had a good answer for what had just happened to their lives. So they focused on the children, which was the only practical thing available. The gas station sat at the intersection of 2 roads that didn't appear on any tourist map. The kind of place that existed purely to serve the people who lived within 10 miles of it and had no interest in anyone else. It had 2 pumps, a hand-painted sign advertising boudin and cracklins, and a television mounted in the top corner of the interior that had been running local news since 6 a.m. Next to the pumps, a billboard the size of a small house showed Homelander with his arms crossed and a line of text reading "Vought International, Protecting America's Future." The face on the billboard was very large and very clean, and looked like it had never been uncertain about anything. The kid in the straw hat walked past it without a glance. He pushed through the glass door and went directly to the hot food case. The woman behind the counter name tag, reading Darlene 60-something. The specific patience of someone who had seen everything her particular corner of the world had to offer. Watched him open the case and begin removing items. A foil-wrapped sausage link. Another. A container of cracklins. A paper boat of something unidentified that had been sitting under the heat lamp long enough to develop opinions about it. He ate the cracklins standing at the counter while she watched. "Honey," she said, "you gonna pay for those?" "Yes." He put the empty container down and dug into the pocket of his cardigan. What he produced was a handful of coins and folded paper that were, Darlene noted, not American currency by any measure she recognized. The coins were gold and larger than quarters. The paper had numbers on it that seemed high and writing she couldn't read. He pushed one of the gold coins toward her first, then changed his mind and pulled it back. Then set out a folded note instead. "This one," he said. "This is a lot. The food costs less than this, right? So you give me change." Darlene looked at the note. She looked at him. She looked at the note again. "Son, what country do you think you're in?" He frowned. "A big one? This is America." He absorbed this. "America uses different money. Dollars, yes." He turned everything in his palm over slowly, with the expression of someone who had just been told the rules of a game had changed mid-play. "But this is real," he said, tapping the coin. "It's gold. Gold is the same everywhere. Not in my register, it isn't." He stared at the coin. He stared at Darlene. Something in his face said he was waiting for the part where this made sense, and that part wasn't coming. Behind him, the television shifted from traffic to breaking news. Aerial footage of a VOT-registered cargo vessel sitting dead in the water approximately 40 nautical miles offshore, surrounded by Coast Guard vessels, with a very large hole in the upper hull that the reporters were describing as consistent with a significant structural failure of unknown origin. He glanced at it. His expression didn't change. He turned back to Darlene. "Can I owe you?" he asked. "You cannot owe me." "Then I'll..." He picked up the remaining foil-wrapped link from the hot case. "I'll figure it out." He was out the door before Darlene had finished deciding what to do about that. She watched through the window as he walked away down the road, shoulder-eating the sausage-link straw hat, catching the morning light, passing right under the Homelander billboard without looking up at it. Then she picked up her phone and called her nephew, who worked for the Paris Sheriff's Department, because this felt like his problem more than hers. And 40 miles north, in a suite on the 14th floor of a building whose lobby featured a 12-foot statue of Homelander, rendered in brushed steel, a man named Kyle Prescott was having a very bad morning. Kyle ran Vaught's Gulf Region Crisis Communications. He had handled 3 toxic spills, 1 soup-related structural collapse in Baton Rouge, and the time the Deep had attempted to liberate a captive dolphin from an aquarium in New Orleans and accidentally destroyed the penguin exhibit instead. He had a system. His system involved controlling the first 4 hours of any narrative, because after 4 hours the story calcified and you were stuck with it. He had not controlled the first 4 hours of this. The ship was a problem. The missing detainees were a worse problem. The footage that one of the surviving crew members had apparently transmitted to 3 separate numbers before the phones were confiscated, that was a catastrophic problem. And the thing that had boarded the ship, broken 11 security personnel's various bones, without apparently using any weapon, stretched its arms in ways that human arms did not stretch, and then left in a company evacuation boat with the cargo that was a problem. Kyle did not have a category for yet. He had people building one. In the meantime, he had approved the following talking points. Unidentified individual with possible compound 5 exposure, believed to be dangerous, believed to be unstable, believed to be operating without sanction from any recognized heroic body. The word believed was doing significant work in all 3 of those sentences. His phone buzzed. The message was from the Vought PR liaison assigned to the 7HL, once a briefing. He saw the morning cut. Kyle set the phone face down on the desk and took a long breath. Homelander's briefings were less like briefings, and more like being required to stand very still in a room with something that was deciding whether you were a threat. You answered the questions you were asked. You did not editorialize. You did not suggest that the situation was anything other than manageable, because implying otherwise meant implying that management was beyond Homelander's capacity, which was the kind of suggestion that ended careers in ways not covered by standard severance. Kyle typed back, confirmed. 30 minutes. Then he went back to the footage. The arm, the distance it had covered. The way the figure had moved through the ship's security force, like the concept of obstacle, had not been fully explained to it. He watched it 4 times. Each time, the thing that stayed with him was not the strength or the speed or the rubber band physics of the limbs. It was the moment at the end, after the detainees were clear, after the guards were down, when the figure stood on the ship's rail and looked back at the hull for 3 full seconds. Not triumphant, not threatening, just registering something. The particular stillness of someone who had noticed a door they hadn't opened yet. Kyle had built a career out of reading intent in body language. Whatever that pause meant, it was not the body language of someone who was finished. Huey Campbell had been in Louisiana for 6 days, which was 5 days longer than he'd planned and 4 days longer than Butcher knew about. The job was supposed to be simple: make contact with a woman named Trisha Vargas, who had left a very specific kind of voicemail on a very specific kind of encrypted line. The kind that meant she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and was still alive enough to want to talk about it. Trisha Vargas had then stopped answering any line, encrypted or otherwise. Huey had spent 4 days finding out why. He'd found out 2 days ago. It was the worst of the 2 possible answers. Trisha Vargas was not findable. What he had found and what was currently sitting across from him in a diner booth outside Huma, eating what appeared to be an entire stack of pancakes. 2 orders of bacon, a bowl of grits, a plate of eggs, and a biscuit was something else entirely. Annie Starlight out here, because she was still technically on the Seven's approved media list and couldn't be seen going off book, had her chin in her hand and was watching the kid eat with the expression of someone trying to file a thing that didn't fit any existing folder. He had walked in 20 minutes ago, sat down without being seated, pointed at the table next to theirs, where another customer had a full plate, and said to the waitress, "That, all of that, many times." The waitress had, after a brief internal debate, decided to just bring things until he indicated otherwise. He had not indicated otherwise. "He's the one from the ship," Annie said quietly. "The footage Vought is calling a structural failure." "Yeah." "He broke the hull." "Yeah." "He's eating pancakes." "Yeah," Huey said. "I see that." The TV above the counter was running the same Vought-approved loop it had been running all morning: aerial shots of the ship, the graphic unknown individual believed dangerous. 30 seconds of a spokesperson reassuring the public that the Seven were coordinating a response. The word coordinated appeared 3 times in 30 seconds, which, in Huey's experience, meant nothing was coordinated at all. The kid glanced up at the screen when the segment came on. He watched it for maybe 4 seconds, head slightly tilted, the same look he'd been giving the menu. "The guy on TV," he said, not really to anyone. He was on a sign outside, a big sign. Huey followed his gaze. The segment had cut to file footage of Homelander at a press conference, Cape Jaw, the full American mythology package talking about security and the safety of the nation's citizens. "That's Homelander?" Annie said. The kid considered the screen. Why does he talk like that? Like what? Like he's telling you something you already know and waiting for you to clap. He went back to his pancakes. "The guys on the ship talk like that. Before I went downstairs." A silence settled over the booth. Annie glanced at Huey. Huey studied his coffee. "What guys on the ship?" Annie asked carefully. "The company's guys." He mopped up syrup with the last piece of pancake. Very formal, like they were reading from a paper. Guys who talk like that usually work for someone who talks the same way. A brief look at the screen. "He looks like someone who has people clean things up for him." It was, Huey thought, possibly the most accurate description of Homelander he had ever heard delivered, with complete unawareness of how accurate it was by someone currently flagging down the waitress for more bacon. "Do you have normal money?" the kid asked. "What?" He reached into his cardigan and spread the coins and notes along the table's edge. The woman at the food place said, "I need dollars. Do you have dollars?" He pushed a gold coin toward Huey. "I can trade. That's real gold. Where I'm from, it buys a lot." Huey picked up the coin. It had a face he didn't recognize and script he couldn't place, not in the alphabet he'd seen. "Where are you from?" Annie asked. The kid took a piece of bacon. "Far." "Like what country?" He seemed to genuinely turn this over. "Not a country. More like a sea." He said it the way someone might say, "The Pacific Northwest," as though it were self-evident, a sufficient and complete geography. Huey opened his mouth and then could not find anything to put in it. Annie watched the kid for another moment. He was eating with total focus, not performing anything, not watching them back. She reached into her jacket and set a folded 20 on the table. "For the food," she said. The kid looked at it. "That's dollars. That's dollars." He picked it up, turned it over, put it in his pocket with the satisfaction of someone whose problem had just been solved, and stood. He was taller than the booth had suggested, and there was something about how he took up space, not aggressive, just fully there, like a load-bearing wall that made the two guys at the counter glance over without meaning to. "Thanks." "Score." He set the gold coin down on Annie's side of the table. "Keep that. It's real." He walked out. Through the window, they watched him stop on the sidewalk, look both ways with no discernible strategy, and turn left. "Okay," Huey said. "Yeah," Annie said. They sat with that. On the TV, the spokesperson was still explaining that civilians should not attempt contact with the unknown individual. Behind him, the footage from the ship showed the same figure moving through armed guards at a pace that made the whole thing look like a nature documentary, one organism. In its element, everything else scrambling to adjust. Annie turned the gold coin between her fingers. "He tried to pay," she said, "at the gas station at the diner. He just didn't know what money to use." "I know. That's not what a weapon looks like, Huey. I know. That's what confused looks like." "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what's worrying me." Outside, the figure in the straw hat had already disappeared around the corner, following whatever his nose was telling him about the next block. Entirely unaware that a national crisis apparatus was building a file around him. Unaware that one of the most dangerous people on the continent had just been handed a briefing with his description in it. Unaware that the two people who'd bought him breakfast were sitting in a vinyl booth arguing about what category he fit. He had bacon a 20 in a direction. For now, that covered everything. The smell hit him 2 blocks before the source did pork fat and char, and something sweet underneath the kind of combination that stops rational thought in its tracks. He followed it off the main road down a side street that narrowed between a shuttered laundromat and a chain-link fence, and found a food truck parked at the edge of a gravel lot with a hand-lettered sign reading "Cochon de Latte, best in parish," and a line of 4 people who had the look of regulars. He joined the line. The man in front of him turned around, took one look at the straw hat and the cardigan and the general quality of someone who had been sleeping outdoors near seawater, and turned back without comment. Louisiana had a high tolerance for eccentric. By the time he reached the window, he had watched 3 transactions happen and had concluded with some disappointment that this was another dollars establishment. He checked his pocket. The 20 was still there. He held it up to the window. "How much of that can I get for this?" he asked. The woman in the truck, mid-40s forearms, like she'd been doing this a long time, looked at the bill, looked at him, and pointed at the menu board. He studied it with genuine effort. "The pork plate," he said. 2, and whatever that is. He pointed at a tray someone had just carried past. "Cracklin' rice. That's $3.50. I'll take 4 of those." She started loading containers. He watched, with the focused approval of someone who had been thinking about exactly this for the past 40 minutes. Behind him, the line shifted and grumbled, and somewhere down the block, a van that had been idling since before he arrived continued to idle. Which was the kind of thing you noticed if you were paying attention to vehicles and did not notice at all if you were watching pork get loaded into takeout containers. He was watching the pork. Sensei Huey had been watching the van. It was a plain white cargo model, no plates on the rear, parked halfway onto the curb across from a row of storage units with their roll doors down. It had been there when he and Annie arrived 20 minutes ago, and it had not moved, which would have been unremarkable except that the engine was running and the windows were tinted past the legal limit for Louisiana, and the two men who'd gotten out to check something in the alley behind the units had the specific posture of people trained to make themselves look less trained than they were. "Vought cleanup," Annie said. She was in the passenger seat of Huey's rental, 3 cars back angled so she could see the storage unit row in the side mirror. "Has to be. Trisha Vargas stored things, somewhere in this block." "I know. If they're here, they already know about the unit." "I know. Which means whoever she was trying to get this stuff to, Annie." He kept his voice flat. "I know." She sat back. On the sidewalk, maybe 60 feet ahead, the kid in the straw hat was receiving an enormous quantity of food through a truck window and looking like he'd just solved a significant personal problem. Huey had spotted him first, which had led to a 5-minute argument conducted entirely in low voices about whether to approach him, follow him, or call butcher, all 3 of which Annie said would be wrong in different ways. "He's going to walk right into it," she said. "Maybe not. Maybe he goes the other direction." "Does he look like someone who goes the other direction?" Huey watched the kid add a side of something to his order. "No," he admitted. The van's side door slid open. 3 men came out of the alley walking fast, which was the kind of movement that reads differently depending on what you're expecting. If you're expecting 3 men, you process it as 3 men. If you're expecting nothing, you have about 4 seconds to recalibrate before they reach wherever they're going. The unit they reached was number 14. One of the men had a bolt cutter. Another had a tablet running some kind of scan. The third watched the street with his hands loose at his sides. None of them were looking at the food truck. The kid had finished paying and was walking away with a stack of containers, eating directly from the top one while balancing the rest. He rounded the corner of the laundromat and stopped. Unit 14 was open now. The man with the tablet was inside moving boxes. The man with the bolt cutter was on his phone. The third, the one watching the street, had turned his back to the food truck to check the alley, which meant he was also facing the kid, and they registered each other at approximately the same moment. The guard stared. The kid looked at him, then into the unit, then back at him. "What's in there?" he asked. The guard reached for his radio. Inside the unit, the man with the tablet had found what he was looking for. A hard case foam line, the kind you use for equipment or documents, too important for a regular bag. He was already resealing it. "Grab it," said the man on the phone. And then he stopped being on the phone because the guard outside made a sound that did not indicate a good situation. The kid had not done anything yet. He was still holding his food containers, but he was looking at the hard case with the particular attention of someone whose brain had just connected 2 things. This teamed those bolts that night offshore and was waiting to hear if the math came out right. "What's in the box?" he said. "Back up," the tablet man said. He had a weapon out. "Back up right now." "I heard someone say, 'No witnesses on the ship,'" the kid said conversationally. "Is that a thing your company does a lot? A beat?" "Is it in the box?" he asked. The tablet man fired. The shot went where it was aimed, which was center mass, and hit rubber, which was not what center mass was supposed to be, and ricocheted off and took a chunk out of the storage unit's corrugated ceiling. The kid was already moving not fast. The way A-Train was fast, not a blur, just suddenly in a different position than he'd been in before, with one hand on the tablet man's wrist and one on the gun, and then the gun was somewhere else, and the tablet man was sitting down, very abruptly, with the expression of someone trying to remember how to breathe. The bolt cutter man came from the left. The kid turned, swinging the hand that had the food containers and 4 takeout boxes of crackling rice, described a short arc that ended in the man's face, messy, undignified, and effective. He went down. The third man, the one who'd been watching the street, ran. The kid straightened up. He looked at the hard case. He looked at the 2 men on the ground. He looked at the spilled rice. "That was my food," he said with more feeling than he'd shown about anything else in the past 30 seconds. Huey was out of the car before Annie, which surprised him. He'd crossed the lot at something between a jog and a run, aware that there had been a gunshot, and then an extremely brief interval of violence, and that the interval was apparently over, and arrived at Unit 14 to find 2 men unconscious. One hard case sitting open on the ground with its contents intact, and the kid in the straw hat crouching over the spilled rice with an expression of genuine mourning. "Are you hit?" Huey said. He heard how that sounded. He said it again anyway. The kid looked at him. The bullet bounced off. The bullet? "I'm rubber," he said without any inflection that suggested this was unusual. He picked up one of the takeout containers that had survived, found it still had something in it, and stood. "You came from the car. You were following me." It was not an accusation. It was the same tone he'd used asking about the food truck. "We thought you might." Huey stopped. "We were in the area. You followed me from the diner." He opened the surviving container. Pork plate mostly intact. He ate standing. "Why?" Annie had come up beside Huey. She looked at the 2 men on the ground, the hard case, the dented ceiling of Unit 14. Then at the kid. "Because you're strong enough to do that." She gestured at the general wreckage. "And we don't know why you're here or what you want." He considered her while chewing. "I wanted the food. Before that, on the ship. I was hungry on the ship too." "You freed people," she said. "You broke a Vought detention operation. Whether you meant to or not, you did something that we've been trying to do for..." "What's in the box?" he asked. She stopped, looked at the hard case. "We don't know yet. Probably what someone named Trisha Vargas was trying to get out before Vought got to her." When he nodded, slow, filing it without pushing on it. "Those men on the ship," he said. "They were taking people somewhere to kill them. These guys were trying to take something that would have proved it." "Yeah," Huey said. "Basically. And the company does this." "Not a question. The one with the big guy on all the signs." "Vought, yes." He looked at the case again, then at the 2 unconscious men, then briefly up at the sky, the same way someone might look at a problem from a different angle to see if it changes. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Annie said. "Okay, I understand more now." He finished the pork set, the empty container, on top of one of the downed men's backs, and picked up the hard case. He held it out to Annie. "This is probably yours." She took it. "Where are you going?" He pointed vaguely up the street. There was another food truck on the corner when I came in. I think it was still open. Huey watched him start walking. "That's it? You're leaving. You have the box." He didn't look back. "You know what to do with it. We don't even know your name." He paused, turned halfway. "Luffy," he said. "That's it, just Luffy." He seemed to find this question slightly confusing. "How many names do you need?" He turned back and kept walking. and 30 seconds later, he was around the corner and out of sight. From somewhere past the chain-link fence came the particular silence of a food truck operator who had heard a gunshot a block away and was now very focused on not having heard anything. Annie was still holding the hard case. Huey was looking at the corner where Luffy had disappeared. "He's going to keep running into Vought operations," Huey said. "Yes. Not because he's looking for them. No. Just because he goes where there's food and Vought is everywhere." Annie turned the case over in her hands. The latch was intact, the foam seal unbroken. Whatever Trisha Vargas had put in here, it was still in here. "We need to call this in," she said, "and we need to figure out where he's sleeping, because if Vought triangulates..." Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The name on the screen made her close her eyes for exactly 1 second. "It's Butcher," she said. Huey took a long breath. Of course it is. The van that had idled on the far side of the block had not moved. Its engine was still running. Inside, a fourth man, the one who'd stayed at the wheel, who'd watched everything through the tinted glass, was already transmitting a 3-word field report to a Vought operations center 40 miles north. "Subject re-engaged. Escalate." 3 hours later, across town, a television in a hotel corridor showed Homelander at an unscheduled press appearance, smiling his most reassuring smile, telling the cameras that any reports of unregistered superpowered activity in Louisiana were being handled with the full resources of the Seven, and that the American public had nothing to worry about. He said it with the ease of a man who believed it. He said it also with the specific tension around the jaw of a man who had just watched a 30-second clip of something he did not have a clean explanation for and found the absence of a clean explanation more irritating than the thing itself. The food truck on the corner was still open. The pork had run out, but they had brisket, and brisket was close enough. The safe house was a rental property in Thibodaux that Butcher had been using for 11 days under a name that wasn't his, paid in cash. Through a third-party operational hygiene that kept people alive in situations where staying alive required effort. It had 2 bedrooms, a working washer-dryer, a deadbolt that actually functioned, and a refrigerator that Huey had stocked 2 days ago with enough food for 4 people over a week. By the time Butcher arrived, the refrigerator contained 3 eggs, half a jar of mustard, and something at the back that might have once been coleslaw. He stood at the open fridge for a long moment. Then he closed it. Then he turned around. The person responsible was sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet and his straw hat pushed up on his forehead, examining a folder of surveillance photographs with the focused attention of someone who found them interesting, but not in the way they were intended to be interesting. "That's classified material." Butcher shut the fridge. "What does this one do?" Luffy held up a photograph. It showed a train in motion caught mid-stride on a city street, the image slightly blurred at the edges from shutter speed. "He's got lightning around him. He runs fast." Butcher pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "Put it back." Luffy put the photo on the stack and picked up another one. "This one has a fish on his costume. That's the Deep. He talks to fish." Luffy considered this seriously. "Is that useful?" "Not particularly." He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth, a technique someone had tried to teach him once for not saying the first thing that came to mind. "Where's Huey?" "In the back room with the woman." "Annie?" "The one with yellow hair?" Luffy set down the folder and picked up a loose photograph that had slid out Homelander at a campaign rally 10 feet tall on a screen behind a senator who looked like he was trying to smile without showing how much he hated standing there. "This is the guy from the signs." "That's Homelander. He's everywhere." "Yeah." Butcher pulled his eyes away from the fridge. "That's rather the point of him." Luffy looked at the photograph for a moment longer than he'd looked at the others. Not with recognition or calculation. Just the same quiet attention he'd given the storage unit, the same beat before something settled into place. The guys on the ship worked for him. They worked for his company. Vought International. He's their main asset. What does that mean? Means he's the one that makes them the most money. And the money is why they put people in boxes and take them out to sea. Butcher paused. He had prepared on the drive over a fairly comprehensive explanation of Vaught's structure, the shell companies, the Compound 5 pipeline, the political cover, the media control apparatus, the way the whole edifice was built to make Supes look like gods and everyone else look like grateful civilians. He had given variations of this explanation to Huey, to members of the CIA, to two separate congressional aides, who had both subsequently developed very convenient amnesia about the conversation. He had not expected to need only the bottom line. "Yes," he said, "that's why." Luffy nodded. He studied the Homelander photograph once more. Then he put it in the folder with the others and slid the folder along the floor to where it had been, with a neatness that suggested he'd noted where things went and returned them exactly more organizational awareness than Butcher had predicted from someone who'd apparently eaten 4 days of food in an afternoon. "He knows about the boxes?" Luffy asked. "He knows about everything." "Then why is he still on the signs?" Butcher opened his mouth, then closed it. It was in its way the correct question, the one that a decade of complicated infrastructure was built to obscure, because the answer required explaining marketing and political dependency and the nature of public belief and how people could know a thing was wrong and still not act on it if the person who embodied it looked confident enough on television. Because people like signs. Luffy thought about this. He didn't look satisfied by it, but he didn't push. "Okay," he said. "So what do you want?" "What?" "You came here on purpose? Rhea, the yellow-haired woman, said you were coming." He rested his elbows on his knees. "So what do you want from me?" Butcher studied him. The hat, the scar, the complete absence of anything resembling agenda or theater. He had met a lot of people who claimed not to have an angle. None of them had ever presented like this, genuinely unaware that angles were a thing one could have. "I want you to hit Homelander." Butcher put it flat on the table between them. "Why can't you do it?" "Because he'd kill me." "And he won't kill me." "He can try." Luffy seemed to find this answer acceptable in a way that would have concerned most people. "What happens if I hit him?" "Ideally, he stops being a problem." "Does that stop Vought from putting people in boxes?" Butcher paused again. This was the part of the conversation he'd planned to get to eventually after more context had been established. The honest answer was not entirely no. There would still be a board of directors and a PR machine and enough political cover to survive one very public embarrassment. Homelander was a symptom, not the illness, but the honest answer also was, it helps more than anything else we've got. "It hurts them badly enough to matter," he said. Luffy looked at him steadily. "You're not telling me all of it. I'm telling you the part that's true." "Those are different things." Something moved through Butcher's expression, not guilt exactly. More like a muscle that had been used so long it didn't register the motion anymore. "In my experience, usually yes." The back bedroom door opened, and Huey came out, followed by Annie, who was carrying the hard case from the storage unit and had the look of someone who had just confirmed something they were hoping to have disproved. "Trisha Vargas had the whole payment trail," Annie said without preamble. "Bank transfers, account numbers, shell companies, she was meticulous. Everything that connects Vought to the detention operation is in this case." She set it on the table. "Which means Vought knows she had it, knows she's gone, and knows it's out here somewhere." "Which means they'll come for it," Huey put in. They'll come for us, Butcher corrected. He looked at Luffy. That bother you? Luffy was looking at the case. She died for that. Nobody answered immediately. The answer was yes, or something close enough to yes, that the distinction didn't matter to the outcome. Yeah, Huey said. She did. Luffy was quiet for a moment. Then, is there more food? You said there was food here. Huey closed his eyes briefly. There was. I was hungry. I know, I saw. He gestured at the fridge. There's a diner 2 streets over. I'll go. I'll go with you. You'll stay here, Butcher said, because there are 3 Vought vehicles that have been circling this block for the past hour, and I'd rather not advertise. He stopped. Luffy had stood up, crossed to the window, and was looking through the gap in the blinds with the unhurried focus of someone checking on something they'd already noticed. The white one, he said, and 2 dark ones further back. The white one's been stopping and going since I got here. Butcher and Annie both moved to the window. The white van was visible at the corner, exactly where Luffy had indicated, moving slowly, stopping, moving again. How long have you known about those? Annie turned from the window. Luffy shrugged. Since I came in. You didn't say anything. You were all talking. He dropped the blind back into place. Do you want me to deal with it now or after food? The silence that followed had a particular quality. The kind that happens when a room full of people recalibrates, not what they expected to be dealing with, but what they're now clearly dealing with. Butcher looked at Huey. Huey looked at Annie. Annie looked at Luffy. After food, she said. How do you want to handle it? Fast, he said, so we can eat while it's warm. The 3 vehicles were dealt with in 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which Huey knew because he timed it from the moment Luffy went out the back door to the moment he came back in. At which point 2 of the surveillance operatives were zip-tied to a storm drain behind the building. And the 3rd was still sitting in his van, but had experienced a quantity of impact sufficient to ensure he would not be transmitting anything for the foreseeable future. The vehicle's communications equipment radios, satellite uplinks, a portable relay tower. One of them had set up on the van roof was neatly stacked in the alley in pieces. Not smashed. Disassembled. That last part was more unsettling than all the rest. There was a 4th one, Luffy said, coming back through the kitchen door. Down the cross street. He drove off when the other one stopped moving. He pulled out the straw hat which he'd been holding for dexterity and put it back on. He'll report it. How long do we have? Butcher asked. I don't know. You know their system better than I do. This was, Huey thought, an incredibly reasonable thing to say. It was also the sort of reasonable that was slightly destabilizing coming from someone who had just disassembled a satellite relay tower in the dark by touch. They relocated 20 minutes later. Butcher's secondary location, a fishing camp 12 miles east that smelled like motor oil and old rope and had a television that only received 4 channels. On the way, they stopped at a drive-thru because the negotiation on that point had been both short and non-negotiable. In the back seat, Luffy worked through 2 bags of food with the systematic efficiency of someone refueling. Butcher rode in front and said nothing for most of the drive, which Huey recognized as the Butcher version of processing something that had come out different than expected. He doesn't follow orders. Not really to anyone. No, Annie agreed. But he's not reckless. He checked the vehicles before we did. He disassembled rather than destroyed because he knew it would slow down their reporting. A pause. He's not stupid. He asked what everything was for, Huey said. Every question he asked was about why. Why do they do it? Who profits? Who gets hurt? He doesn't care about tactics. He cares about whether a thing is wrong. From the back seat around the last of the food, I can hear you. Butcher turned in his seat. Good, he said. Then hear this. I'm not asking you to work for me. I'm telling you that Homelander is going to come for you personally, because that's what he does when something doesn't fit his picture of the world. When that happens, I'd prefer to have some advance notice so we can be somewhere useful. That's all. Luffy was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the dark highway, lit signs going past gas stations, fast food, a billboard with Homelander's face on it that was the same as all the others. I don't take orders, Luffy said. Noted. But if they're still doing what they're doing... He didn't finish the sentence, just looked at the billboard a second longer as it slid past. Then they're going to keep running into me anyway. Butcher looked at that profile. The hat, the scar, the quality of someone who had just said something that was both very simple and very final. Yeah, he said. They are. In a building 40 miles away, a television screen showed a man in a cape at an unscheduled media appearance. He was smiling with the precision of someone who had practiced smiling until the practice disappeared. He spoke about safety and strength and the Seven's commitment to the American people. He said unregistered and unvetted and threat in the same sentence and made all three sound like the same word. And in the back seat of a car on a Louisiana highway, someone who had never heard of the Seven, had no opinion about America, mostly wanted to know if the drive-thru had gotten the order right, fell asleep against the window with his hat over his face, while the billboards went past in the dark. He hadn't promised anything. He hadn't joined anything, but he'd said they're going to keep running into me anyway. And in Butcher's experience, a sentence like that had a way of making itself true. The brisket place had been Huey's idea, and it was a good one, a roadside spot east of the fishing camp with a smoker the size of a small car parked outside and a handwritten board listing exactly 4 items, none of which required explanation. They'd been there 40 minutes. Luffy had worked through the equivalent of what the menu board estimated as 6 servings and was now on his 7th. Sitting on the hood of Huey's rental with both legs dangling and a paper plate balanced on one knee, watching the smoke come off the cooker with the serene attention of someone who had nowhere to be and nothing to resolve. Huey was on his phone. Annie was watching the road. Butcher was in the car doing something on a laptop that he hadn't described to anyone. This is the best thing in this country. Luffy balanced the plate on his knee and looked at the smoker. The brisket, all of it. He gestured at the smoker, the board, the general principle of the thing. Very direct. You want meat. Here is meat. That's it. Yeah. Huey pocketed his phone. It's a good system. A notification buzzed on Annie's phone. She looked at it, and something in her posture changed, not dramatically. Just the small shift of someone absorbing bad news in real time. Vought just put out a statement, she said. They're calling Luffy an unregistered Compound V subject. Possible hostile foreign asset. She paused. They used the phrase, credible threat to national security 4 times. Luffy took a bite of brisket. What's Compound 5? The thing that makes soups, Huey said. They're saying you were created by a foreign government. He considered this while chewing. I wasn't. We know. I ate a fruit. We know that too. Huey glanced up the road. The problem is most people won't. Luffy looked at the smoker, then back at his plate. The smoke was going straight up, no wind late afternoon, the air thick and warm and very still. So, they make a story and people believe the story. That's usually how it works, yeah. He went back to eating without apparent distress about this which Huey found simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. Before he could decide which feeling to act on, Butcher knocked on the car window from inside and held up the laptop screen. On it, a Vought internal channel, one of the ones they weren't supposed to have access to, was running a live position update. The label on the update read, A-Train Intercept Authorized. Huey looked at the screen, looked at the road, looked at Luffy. Luffy was finishing the last of the brisket. A-Train came in from the east at full speed, which meant the first indication of his arrival was a sound like a pressure wave followed by a streak of blue and red that covered the distance from the tree line to the parking lot in the time it took Huey to turn his head. He pulled up 20 feet out, gravel spraying, and stood in the lot with his chest heaving slightly, not from exertion, from the theatrical necessity of the moment, and pointed. "You." He had a finger aimed at Luffy. "Step away from the vehicle." Luffy looked at him, then at the finger, then at his own plate, which still had the last piece of brisket on it. He looked back at A-Train. "I'm eating," he said. That's not A-Train reset. The earpiece, the form, the stance. You're being detained under emergency powers granted to... The fish guy was more interesting. Luffy finished the brisket, set the plate down. He at least had a theme. A-Train's jaw tightened. This was not how intercepts went. Intercepts went a specific way. You arrived fast. You made the statement. The target either complied or escalated. And either way, you had footage of you being professional and decisive, which was the point. The target was not supposed to reference your colleagues while finishing their lunch. Last warning. A-Train reset his stance. Luffy slid off the hood. He wasn't squaring up exactly. He just landed on the ground and stood there with his hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted, looking at A-Train the way you'd look at whether you were deciding whether to bother with. "Go ahead then." A-Train moved. He hit speeds that turned him into geometry, a line, an angle, a direction, and the first pass went exactly where he aimed it, which was Luffy's center, and connected with rubber, and A-Train kept moving because at his velocity, stopping was a separate decision from going. And he'd covered 40 feet past the point of contact before he fully registered that the contact had not accomplished what contact was supposed to accomplish. He came back around. Luffy was still standing. The straw hat had shifted about 2 degrees to the left. "Huh," Luffy said. The second pass came from a different angle. A-Train had learned in the first exchange that straight lines weren't working. So he curved, pulling a tight arc that brought him in low and fast from the left side. Luffy stepped back just barely, and the blur of motion passed close enough to pull at his cardigan. Third pass, fourth A-Train. Moving faster and with more anger each time, eating at the distance between moves, trying to build a rhythm that would find a gap. He wasn't finding one. Not because Luffy was matching his speed, he clearly wasn't, not in the same way, but because the gaps A-Train was looking for required a target that was thinking about defense, and Luffy wasn't doing that. He was just present, tracking, shifting, absent from the exact point A-Train was trying to reach, the way water is absent from the place you put your hand. "You're fast," Luffy said. He didn't sound impressed. He sounded like someone acknowledging a fact. "But you keep going the same directions." Annie was against the car, watching. "He's not even trying yet." Very quietly. "I know," Huey said. He was watching A-Train, not Luffy, watching the frustration building in the rhythm of the passes, the way each failed contact made the next one slightly less clean. "This is going to go wrong. A-Train's going to do something stupid." "Yeah." Tank. What A-Train did was stop treating it like an intercept and start treating it like a fight, which was a different thing with different rules. And the first thing he did under the new rule set was grab a woman who had been standing at the edge of the parking lot since the start of the confrontation, having arrived at the brisket place for lunch, and then been frozen in place by events, and put her between himself and Luffy as a moving shield, his arm across her chest, pulling her backward fast enough to take her off her feet. She screamed. Luffy stopped moving. Not slowly, the way a switch stops. A-Train started talking something about compliance, about backing down, about how this ended, but the words were filling air that had already changed quality, the specific quality of a room when the temperature drops without a thermostat. Luffy's expression was not angry in any way that A-Train would have recognized from a fight. There was no heat in it. There was just a direction. "Put her down," Luffy said. "Or what you going to hit me while I'm—" The arm that came for him covered 12 feet in a fraction of a second. Not toward him, but past him, wrapping once around the woman's waist from behind, before A-Train had finished the sentence, and she was somewhere else. 10 feet to the left, set down on her feet beside Annie's car, and A-Train's arm was suddenly around nothing. He had maybe a quarter second to process this. He used it wrong, going for speed instead of distance, launching another blurred pass. Gear second. Luffy exhaled it almost to himself, the words very quiet. Not performance, just notation, and then he was moving in a way he hadn't been moving before. Steam rising off his skin in thin curls, every motion carrying a different weight. He caught A-Train mid-pass by the ankle one hand, and the trajectory that had been aimed at Luffy redirected, not blocked, redirected the way you redirect a river by changing what it runs into. A-Train hit the steel support column of the smoker's overhang at a speed that made the entire structure shudder. He hit it once. Then Luffy's arm was at full extension across the parking lot, and he came back. The second impact was the one that mattered. There was a sound, like two different kinds of breakage happening at once. A-Train went down onto the gravel, and the leg, the right one, the one that had taken the angle of impact, was bent at a geometry that legs did not achieve through normal use. He made a sound, not a word, just a sound. Luffy stood at the far end of the parking lot and looked at him. The steam was already dissipating. His hat was still on. "I said put her down," he said. It was not a threat. It was not a verdict. It was just the sentence that had been interrupted, now completed. Butcher came out of the car. He looked at A-Train on the gravel, at the structural column with the new dent in it, at Luffy, who had walked back to the hood of the rental and was looking at his empty plate with the expression of someone who had been robbed of a peaceful afternoon. "Right." Butcher looked at the dent in the steel column, then at A-Train. Then he put his hands in his pockets. Nobody elaborated on that. Annie went to the woman. She was standing against the car, shaking unhurt, staring at Luffy with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and complete inability to categorize what she'd just seen. Annie put a hand on her arm, said something quiet, steered her toward the diner's side door. The woman went. She didn't look back. Huey crouched near A-Train, not close, just assessing. The man was alive, conscious, in significant pain. His earpiece had fallen out and was on the gravel next to him. And from it, if you listened, you could faintly hear someone at the other end saying A-Train's name and not getting an answer. "He needs medical," Huey said. "He'll call it himself. They always do." Luffy had found a handful of napkins and was folding them in a way that suggested he was considering whether any brisket had survived the general chaos. It hadn't. He looked at the paper plate now, overturned on the gravel, and briefly at A-Train, and then at the brisket counter window where the owner was watching from inside, with the expression of a man who was going to need a significant amount of time before he could process any of this as a business event. "Can I get another plate?" Luffy called through the window. The owner stared at him. "I'll pay with dollars this time," Luffy added. "Huey has some." Tux, 300 miles north in a room that existed specifically for watching things. Homelander was not supposed to have strong feelings about a screen showed him 37 seconds of footage from a traffic camera near the brisket place. The angle was bad parking lot periphery looking east, but the relevant elements were visible. The blurs of A-Train's passes, the moment of the redirect, the impact, the leg. Homelander watched it once. He had a glass of water in his hand, which he set down on the table with a care that was slightly more deliberate than the situation required. The person presenting the footage, a Vought VP whose name was not important, said something about the footage being contained, about the cover story being ready, about A-Train's condition being serious but survivable. Homelander nodded. Who else saw it? Homelander kept his eyes on the screen. We're working on who else saw it. The VP gave numbers. Witnesses at the location, possible bystanders with phones. The traffic camera feed, which had already been flagged for review by the company that operated it. Homelander nodded again. He picked up the glass and held it. The footage was paused on the last frame, A-Train, on the gravel Luffy at the far end of the lot. The geometry of the outcome very clear even at this resolution. It wasn't the power that bothered him. He'd seen power before. Power was a known quantity. What bothered him was the posture, the hat, the way the whole thing had read on camera as something that had been handled rather than fought the way you handle handle a thing that isn't quite worth your full attention. He had never been handled. Tell the 7 to stand down. I'll take the next meeting personally. The VP opened his mouth. Personally? Homelander said again, and his voice had the quality it got when he wasn't asking. The VP closed his mouth and left the room. And Homelander remained where he was watching the paused footage, with the particular stillness of someone deciding what something meant to them, and not liking the answer. The fish smell hit 3 blocks out, which meant Luffy had already changed direction twice before Huey noticed he was no longer following the car. He's gone again, Huey said. Annie looked in the passenger mirror. The road behind them was empty. How long? Since the light? She checked her phone. No messages. He'll find us when he's hungry. He's always hungry. Then he'll find us soon. The processing facility at the edge of the industrial pier had been running since 4 a.m., which was the kind of operation that made sense if you were shipping fresh catch up the coast and needed the cold chain unbroken. By 7 in the morning, the loading docks smelled like the bottom of the Gulf made physical, and the men who worked there had developed the particular immunity to odor that came from spending enough hours inside it. Luffy had no such immunity, but he also had no objection. Fish was fish. He'd found the unlatched side door by following the cold air coming through the gap at the bottom, which in turn he'd followed because cold air coming through gaps in warehouses often meant refrigerated storage, which often meant food. He worked his way through the cold room methodically, not ransacking, just sampling. A tray of something packed in ice. A crate of what turned out to be oysters, which he ate raw and without pause, putting the shells in a neat pile because the floor was already clean and there was no reason to make it worse. Shrimp still in the shell, cooked and sitting in a bucket near the secondary cooler. He ate those too, leaning against the wall, and was halfway through evaluating a wrapped section of tuna when the dock-facing door banged open and a man in a green wetsuit walked in backwards, pulling a camera crew with him. Luffy stopped chewing. The man in the wetsuit, tall, broad, with the kind of jaw that required specific lighting to look as impressive as it apparently was supposed to, turned around and registered him with the particular jolt of someone who had prepared extensively for this moment and had not prepared for this. "You," the man said. Luffy looked at him, at the wetsuit, at the stylized wave emblem on the chest, at the camera. "Are you the one who owns the fish, a beat?" "I'm the Deep," the man said. Luffy looked at the tuna. back at the deep. "Is this your fish?" "I'm a member of the Seven. I'm here to..." "So it's not your fish?" The deep's jaw worked. Behind him, the camera crew exchanged a glance of the kind that suggested this was not the opening they'd been briefed on. He'd prepared a speech. It had an arc. There was a line at the end about the ocean reclaiming what humanity had defiled, which had tested very well in the focus group. "This dock," he said with the tone of someone restarting from the top, "sits on my domain. The water beneath it, the creatures within it, they answer to me. And you," he pointed, "have been disrupting the natural order of..." "There's more shrimp in that bucket," Luffy said, pointing past him. "Are you going to eat any of it?" "What? No. I'm not here to..." "Then I'll finish it." He went back to the shrimp. The deep stood in the doorway of the cold room with his camera crew behind him and his speech notes somewhere in his head, and his carefully assembled authority sitting at roughly the same temperature as the oyster ice. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he tried. "I can call every creature in these waters, every fish, every..." "Can you call the tuna back?" Luffy held up the empty wrapper. "I finished it." One of the camera operators made a very small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The deep turned to look at them, which was a mistake because it took his eyes off the bucket of shrimp for 4 seconds, and when he turned back, it was empty. He did, in fairness, try. The deep retreated to the dock and made good on the claim about calling sea life a school of something large, came up under the pier and hit the support pylons from below, rattling the whole structure. 2 catfish the size of dogs came over the edge of the dock. A pelican arrived on the rail and looked at Luffy with the specific emptiness of a bird following instructions it didn't understand. Luffy had followed him out to the dock and was watching all this with mild interest. "That's actually useful," he said about the catfish. "Can they cook?" "They're attack animals," the deep said through his teeth. "They don't look very angry." The catfish, for what it was worth, did not look very angry. They sat on the dock planking and oriented themselves toward Luffy in the manner of animals that had been told to do a thing, and were now reconsidering the logistics. The deep raised both hands, and the water under the pier surged, a column of it pushing up through a gap in the decking and hitting the roof of the loading overhang, which was not rated for that kind of lateral force. The bolts on the overhang support brackets made a sound like staples pulling from paper, one after another, and the whole structure lurched 6 inches to the left. "Huh," Luffy said. "Luffy, stand down," the deep said, pointing at him. "Or I bring the whole pier." The overhang came down. Not all of it, the central span, stayed up, but the eastern section, the part with the camera crew on it, dropped 4 feet and stopped, caught by one remaining bracket that was now doing the work of 8. The camera crew were fine clinging to their equipment and the rail. The bracket was not fine. It made sounds. The deep had not accounted for the angle of the water column. He had also not accounted for the fact that when the overhang lurched, the steel support runner along the dock's edge swung on its pivot and came down across both his legs with the weight of 30 feet of industrial grating behind it. He went down. He didn't go down quietly. There was a significant amount of language which the camera crew was still recording, because the camera was still running, which Vaught's PR team would later spend considerable resources trying to suppress. Luffy walked over. The deep was pinned from the knee down both legs, the grating across him like a bar. He was alive, not critically hurt, but the situation was deeply undignified, and he appeared to be stuck in it for the foreseeable future. "Can you lift that?" the camera crew called over, meaning the grating. Luffy looked at it, looked at the deep. The deep was looking up at him with the expression of someone who had many things to say and was trying to choose the most important one. "If you get me out of here," the deep said very carefully, "I'll tell Vought to..." "You talk a lot," Luffy said. He reached down, gripped the Deep by the front of the wetsuit, and lifted him out from under the grating with one hand. Grating and all the grating rising with him until Luffy set him down clear of it and let the steel drop back onto the dock with a clang. The Deep stood wobbled, sat down again because his legs weren't cooperating. He started talking again. Something about this not being over, about Homelander, about consequences. Luffy waited. The Pelican watched from the rail. When the Deep paused to breathe, Luffy hit him once flat in the center of the chest. Not a full-weight blow, more like a period at the end of a sentence. The Deep sat down extremely fast and stayed down, eyes open and glassy chest, moving conscious enough to be humiliated and not conscious enough to do anything about it. The catfish slid back into the water. The Pelican left. Luffy looked at the camera crew who had not moved. "Are you done?" he asked. They were done. Huey had found the pier by following the sound of structural failure, which was not something he'd ever expected to use as a navigation method. He arrived in time to see the overhang's eastern section hanging at its awkward angle, and the Deep sitting in a puddle of dock water, looking like he'd been through a weather event. Annie was 2 steps behind him. She took in the scene, the grating, the overhang, the Pelican that was now sitting on a piling, 50 feet out, the camera crew lowering their equipment carefully from the damaged section of dock, and exhaled slowly. "Did he do that to himself?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Mostly," Luffy said. He was back on the edge of the dock, sitting with his legs over the side, working through the remaining contents of a crate of smoked fish he'd found in the cold room on the way out. He pushed the water wrong. The roof came down. Butcher had come in last. He stood at the entrance to the dock and looked at the Deep for a long moment. "Pathetic," he said. Then to Luffy, "You didn't even break a sweat." He was loud. Luffy pulled a piece of smoked fish apart, and he kept talking about the ocean like it was going to help him. "Did it?" Luffy gestured at the general wreckage. "Not really." Butcher looked at the camera that was still running on its tripod, apparently abandoned by the crew in the scramble. He went over and turned it off. Then he looked at the Deep again, who was showing signs of returning consciousness and already appeared to be calculating whether there was a version of events here that could be presented to Homelander as anything other than what it was. There wasn't. Butcher had seen enough of these to know. He pulled out his phone. In the same room where he'd watched the A-Train footage 2 days prior, Homelander sat through 41 seconds of dock camera recording before the feed cut to static. 41 seconds was enough. The last image before the cut was the Deep one of the 7. A founding member, a face on merchandise, sitting in a puddle looking up at someone who had then walked away to eat fish. Walked away. He set the phone on the table, picked it up again, set it down. The 7 had 6 remaining members, not counting himself. Of those 6, 2 were now non-functional. The public story was holding barely patchworked with press releases and redirected coverage and the general willingness of people to believe the official version if it was delivered with enough confidence. But that had limits. Everything had limits. He stood up. The room was empty except for him, which was how he preferred it for this kind of thinking. The window looked out over a city that had his face on 3 buildings visible from this angle. His face smiling. His face arms crossed. His face on a bus shelter ad that read, "America's Guardian." He'd never particularly liked that tagline. It implied something to be guarded against, which implied vulnerability, which was not the image. The thing on the dock, the thing that had walked away to eat fish, did not look vulnerable. That was the problem. Not the power, not even the win, the posture, the fundamental indifference. He had never in his entire life been treated with indifference. Fear worship occasional hate. Never indifference. He reached for the phone again and made a call. "Cancel whatever I have tomorrow," he said. "I'll handle this myself." The town had about 800 residents on a normal day. On this day, it had maybe 40, most of them, pressed against the chain-link fence at the north end of Main Street, watching equipment trucks unload things that didn't belong in a small Louisiana town on a Thursday afternoon. Lighting rigs, a satellite uplink van, 3 vehicles that looked like police cruisers, until you noticed the Vought logo on the door panels where the precinct numbers should have been. Butcher had found this place 2 hours ago. He'd been looking for it, or something like it, since the A-Train footage started circulating in ways Vought couldn't entirely contain. When a company started losing the narrative, it didn't abandon the narrative. It built a new one on top of it. They're staging an incident. Annie kept the binoculars up, scanning from the hardware store roof 1 block east. Controlled environment. They pick the camera angles, they pick the light, they pick who's standing where. And they pick who gets hurt. Huey watched a lighting rig get bolted to a crane arm below. And they pick who gets hurt. She lowered the binoculars. They've done this before. There's a protocol. They move residents out of the damage zone, they put a few back in for footage, and they control the exit. What happens to the ones they put back in? She didn't answer. The answer was in the file on Butcher's phone. 4 incidents, 3 settlements sealed under ND. One that hadn't settled because the family hadn't survived to sign. Luffy was not on the hardware store roof. Luffy was at the far end of the block, standing in front of a food truck that had apparently been in the middle of setting up for the day when the Vought vehicles arrived, and now sat abandoned with its service windows still open and a tray of something involving sausage still sitting on the prep counter. He had let himself in through the side door, which was unlocked, and was eating standing at the prep station with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that windows of opportunity were brief. He's going to walk into that. Huey didn't move. "Yes," Butcher agreed. "Should we?" "He's going to walk into it regardless. The question is whether we're positioned when he does." The staging ground occupied 3 blocks. At the center, 2 Vought operatives in tactical gear directed a cluster of people, 7 of them residents, who had been told this was a mandatory evacuation exercise, and then told to stand at specific marks on the pavement toward a section of street where a car had been flipped on its side, and a shop window broken, and a controlled charge in a trash receptacle 40 feet away was set to go off at a timed interval. The narrative being built, unknown dangerous entity attacked a civilian area. The 7 responded. Footage would show the after effects of an attack populated with real frightened people, and then show a Vought spokesperson arriving to manage the situation. The entity in question would be described. The description would not be accurate. A man in a headset walked the 7 residents through their positions. "You're scared. You've just been through something terrible. Stay where I put you. React to the noise and try to look at camera 2 if you can." He checked his clipboard. "We'll get you out before the second charge." He did not specify what the second charge was for. At the edge of the staging ground past the barricade and the Vought-badged cruisers, someone had left the food truck accessible because the food truck had not been part of the plan and therefore had not been planned around. The figure who emerged from it eating something wrapped in foil was also not part of the plan. Luffy stopped at the barricade, looked at the flipped car, looked at the people standing at marks on the pavement, looked at the cameras. He ate another bite of sausage. "Why is that car upside down?" he asked the nearest operative. The operative turned, registered him, reached for a radio. "And why are those people standing in the middle of the street?" Luffy continued. "There's no reason to stand there." The operative keyed the radio. "We have a civilian breach at the south perimeter." "Are those people okay?" Luffy watched the cluster of residents, 7 people standing at marks on the pavement, frozen in position. The body language of people who'd been told where to stand and were now not entirely sure why. They look like they're waiting for something. Sir, you need to... Did you put them there? This is a controlled... Did you put them there? Not a question this time. The foil wrapper went into a pocket. Huey heard it from the hardware store roof, the headset man's voice carrying on the still air directing things, and then a different voice, a voice he'd come to recognize as the one that meant a decision had already been made. If they look scared, we get the shot. If they actually get hurt, the insurance payout is cheaper than reshooting. Either way, we get something usable. Push them out. 3 seconds of silence. Annie had the binoculars up. He heard that. Yeah. Butcher's jaw was tight. All of it. Yeah. Below them at the south barricade, the figure in the straw hat was very still. Not tense, stillness and tension were different things. And Luffy had a specific quality of stillness that was the opposite of tension, the kind that happened when everything external became irrelevant, because something internal had already finished deciding. The half-eaten sausage was somewhere on the ground. He hadn't noticed putting it there. The headset man had not registered the stillness. He was already on his next task, walking toward a camera 2, adjusting something. Get those people back. To no one in particular, to everyone in earshot. Get them off the marks. The operative at the barricade moved to grab his arm. What happened to the operative's arm instead was brief and resulted in him sitting on the asphalt. Luffy stepped over the barricade. What Vought had at the staging ground was 6 operatives in tactical gear. 4 soup-adjacent assets, not full soups, compound-boosted private security with enhanced strength and reaction speed, 1 camera crew of 3 2-satellite trucks, and a lighting rig on a crane arm that cost more than some of the houses in this town. What Vought did not have was a plan for this. Gomu Gomu no Gatling. The 4 enhanced assets came forward in a coordinated spread, the right tactical choice, and also the last coordinated thing they managed. The Gatling was not a single punch. It was a cascade, both arms at full extension, cycling faster than individual impacts could be tracked, and the 4 of them took it in approximately 1.5 seconds. They went in different directions. The camera on crane arm 2 was still running. Luffy looked at it. He grabbed the crane arm at its midpoint, the whole rig camera and counterweight, and pivot, and pulled. The crane folded. He set the pieces on the ground without throwing them, which took slightly more effort, but produced less collateral. The camera housing cracked, but stayed attached. Gear second. Steam. A different quality of movement, the same body, different physics, the air around him warming slightly. He crossed the staging ground in 2 seconds, reached the satellite truck first, and hit it once in the drive assembly. The uplink died. The operator bailed out the passenger side and ran. Smart. The headset man had not run. He was standing near camera 2 with his clipboard and the expression of someone who had not yet fully accepted that his job description no longer applied. You said they were props. Luffy stepped closer. The headset was still around the man's neck. That's not what I heard you. The headset man looked at his clipboard, at the camera, at Luffy. The footage is already... I don't care about the footage. He picked up camera 2 from its tripod, examined it briefly, and put it face down on the asphalt. Not slammed, placed. Then he stood on it once, which was enough. The remaining operatives had regrouped near the perimeter. There were 4 of them still functional, and they made the decision to rush simultaneously, which meant Luffy had to deal with them simultaneously, which he did too. Bazooka 1 pistol to the far left, 1 close-range arm extension that wrapped an operative's tactical vest and redirected him into the side of the second satellite truck. The truck's uplink antenna came down. "No shot," someone said into a radio somewhere. "We've lost both feeds." The 7 residents were still at their marks, frozen watching. One of them, an older woman in a yellow jacket who had been told this was a routine exercise, was looking at the man in the straw hat with an expression that had traveled quickly through fear and confusion and was now somewhere closer to, I think I understand what just happened. Luffy walked over to her. "You can go." "Where?" she asked. "Wherever you were before they moved you here." She looked at the marks on the pavement, at the flipped car, at the broken window and the disabled cameras, and the Vought operatives sitting on the asphalt in various postures of defeat. Then she looked at him, and something in her face did the math, and she nodded, and she started walking north, and the other 6 followed her. Huey came into the staging ground from the east side, stepping over a section of crane arm. Annie was already there. Butcher came in last, walking slowly, hands in his pockets, the measured, deliberate pace of someone taking inventory. The headset man was sitting against the flipped car. He still had his clipboard. Old habits. "Vought won't," he started. "Don't." Butcher kept walking. The man closed his mouth. The staging ground had the quality of a set after the cast has left everything purposeful a minute ago now, just objects. Fake police cruisers, a broken window that had been broken intentionally. Marks on the pavement nobody was standing on anymore. Luffy was at the food truck. He'd found his way back to it, recovered the sausage from the ground still in foil, mostly intact, and was eating again. Sitting on the truck's rear bumper with his legs hanging off. "That's off the ground," Huey said. "It's fine." "It's been on the ground for... It's fine." Huey decided not to push. He looked at Annie. Annie was watching the staging ground with an expression that wasn't satisfaction, wasn't grief, wasn't anger. Just the flat tiredness of someone who had known something was this bad and had still hoped it was slightly less bad. They were going to blow the second charge with those people standing there. I know. And then they were going to put it on Luffy. I know. Butcher crouched near the headset man's clipboard. He picked it up, looked at it for a moment, the shot list, the blocking notes, the insurance contact for incident-related property claims. He turned it over, put it face down on the asphalt, the same way Luffy had put the camera. Annie. He crouched near the headset man's clipboard. How many of Trisha's files mentioned these staged operations? 14 separate incidents, with names. Right. He stood. Then tonight we make copies. From the food truck. Is there anything else in here? Luffy. Huey looked at the container. What? We're talking about evidence. I know. I'm listening. He found something else in the truck and held it up, a sealed container of something. Can I have this? Yes, Annie answered. Thanks. She looked at Butcher. Butcher looked at the remains of the staging ground. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that 14 incidents with names was enough to break this open if they could get it to the right people. And that the right people were fewer and harder to reach than they used to be. And that the one element they had that Vought had not planned for was currently eating cold food off a truck bumper and had no interest whatsoever in being managed. That was either the problem or the solution. Possibly both. In an office building that Vought owned entirely, and the public records listed under a different name, a screen showed 2 dead feeds, 1 timestamp, and a field report. Staging operation compromised. Both uplinks down, no usable footage. Next to the field report, someone had appended a note. Subject referenced HL by incorrect name during engagement. Captured on ground-level camera before unit loss. Clip attached. The clip was 11 seconds. It showed Luffy mid-stride across the staging ground, one of the operatives saying, "Homelander will hear about this," and Luffy not breaking stride, not even looking at the operative. "Home what the Cape guy, tell him whatever you want." 11 seconds. In a different room, in a different building, someone watched those 11 seconds 4 times. He watched them with the specific attentiveness of someone cataloging an insult so precise it hadn't fully registered as an insult yet. The Cape guy. He set the phone down. He picked it up again. He went to his contacts and found a name he had not called since the last time something had required his personal attention. He put the phone to his ear. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll be there tomorrow." Ryan Butcher was 11 years old and had by any reasonable measure already lived through more than most adults managed in a lifetime. He had watched his mother die. He had learned what his eyes could do by accident in a way he did not like to think about. He had been taken to places and shown things by a man who called himself his father and wanted something from him that Ryan could not name precisely, but could feel the way you feel a current in water before you see which way it's moving. He was currently standing on the roof of a parking structure in downtown Shreveport in a blue jacket that Aunt and Homelander had picked out in front of a camera crew that Homelander had arranged next to a man named Derek, who kept telling him to stand up straight. "Shoulders back." Derek adjusted Ryan's left shoulder with 2 fingers. "You want to project?" Ryan stood up straight. He did not know what he was projecting or to whom. Below the street had been cleared for 2 blocks. The story the one Derek had explained on the drive over the one Homelander had approved was that Ryan would be introduced today as the next generation of American protection. A visual, a statement. Footage for a segment that would run on 3 networks before dinner. Ryan had asked in the car whether he had to do anything specific. Derek had said, "Just stand there and look like you belong." Ryan had not said anything back. He was good at not saying things back. He had learned that from his mother, who had used silence the way other people used walls. Homelander was at the far end of the roof on a call facing away. He held the phone with the same precision he held everything, like the object was aware of being held by him and should be grateful. God, Huey spotted the crane first. Not the parking structure, the crane. It was 3 blocks north, extending over the street at an angle that made no construction sense, which meant it wasn't construction equipment. It was a camera rig. He'd seen the same setup in the staging ground footage from 2 nights ago. "Vaught's running another shoot," he told Annie over the earpiece. "Bigger this time. Street clearance crane cam the works." "Where are you?" "Street level east side." "I've got eyes on the structure." He shifted behind a parked delivery truck. "There's a kid on the roof." A pause. "Ryan?" "Has to be. He's the right age. He's got the jacket." Another pause longer. "Where's Homelander?" "Same roof, far end." Huey adjusted his angle. "He's not looking at the kid. He's on a call." "That's worse?" Annie lowered the binoculars. "That means Ryan's up there with handlers and no one he actually trusts." Huey watched Ryan stand with his shoulders back, very still, looking at nothing in particular with the practiced blankness of someone who had been told to look a certain way often enough to do it without thinking. 2 kinds of stillness. Luffy's full and present occupying space completely. And this one learned the stillness of someone who had discovered that taking up less room made things easier. He had seen that stillness before, on different people in different situations. It always meant the same thing. "Where's Luffy?" "Us." Luffy had found the parking structure by following the camera crane's shadow, which at this time of day pointed south and happened to point directly at a food cart he'd been tracking for the past 20 minutes. He'd eaten at the cart, a very good po' boy, the second of 2, and then looked up and seen the crane, and then seen the cleared street, and then walked toward the structure. because cleared streets in the middle of the day in a functioning city were always worth investigating. He was on the second level of the parking structure, having come up the vehicle ramp, when he heard voices from the stairwell above. Not in distress, just wrong. The flat-managed quality of people who were doing a job they found routine. He went up. The roof was large and mostly empty, which made the group near the north rail. Easy to read from 30 feet away, camera crew on the right. A man named Derek, who kept touching the kid's shoulders to adjust his posture. The kid himself, who was maybe 11 and had the jacket of someone who had been dressed, rather than the jacket of someone who had chosen what to wear, and at the far end back turned a man on a phone whose posture Luffy recognized from television. He recognized the cape first, then the jawline. When the man turned slightly, the one from the signs. Luffy stood at the rooftop access door and assessed the situation with the same attention he'd given the food truck at the staging ground, the cold room at the pier, the boarding ramp of the Vought ship, not tactical, not calculating, just present. Taking in what was actually there. What was actually there? A kid being positioned in front of cameras. He hadn't asked for, adjusted by a handler. He clearly didn't know. While the man who was supposed to be his father stood 40 feet away doing something more important. Luffy walked over to the camera crew first. "Turn those off." The crew turned to look at him. Derek turned. The kid turned. Homelander did not turn. He was still on the call. "Excuse me." Derek stepped forward. "The cameras. Turn them off." He wasn't loud. He wasn't threatening. "He doesn't want this." "That's not," Derek started. "You keep pushing his shoulders." Luffy's attention moved past Derek entirely straight to Ryan. "Do you want to be here?" Ryan stared at him. The hat, the scar, the complete absence of any agenda that Ryan could detect, and he had become very good at detecting agendas. "Who are you?" Ryan asked. "Luffy." Ryan processed this. "Are you the one who, the ship in A-Train?" "Yes." "You're not what I thought you'd look like." "What did you think?" Ryan considered it honestly, the kind of consideration that required not worrying about the right answer. "Bigger." Luffy seemed to find this fair. "Do you want to be on this roof?" Ryan glanced at Derek. At the cameras, at Homelander's back, still turned still on the call, not once having looked over. "No." It came out quieter than he intended and more certain than he expected. "Okay." Luffy turned back to Derek. "He's leaving." Homelander ended the call. He turned around with the timing of someone who had been aware of the situation for longer than his body language suggested. And he took in the tableau, his camera crew standing down Derek with his clipboard and an expression of total uncertainty. Ryan 2 steps away from a figure in a straw hat who was apparently explaining something very simple in very direct terms. He walked forward, not fast. The measured pace of someone who owned the ground they were crossing. "I know who you are." Homelander stopped 2 meters out. Luffy glanced at him, back at Ryan. "Go find Annie. She's on the street east side. Yellow hair. Tell her it's fine." Ryan looked at Homelander, at Luffy. Something moved across his face, not decision exactly, but the precursor to decision the moment before a door opens. He went to the stairwell. Homelander watched him go. His face did not change. That was the tell, not what showed, but what he was keeping from showing. "You just," he started. "He didn't want to be here. He's my son. That doesn't mean he has to stand on a roof for cameras." Homelander stopped 2 meters away. Up close, he was larger than the sign suggested, the suit, the cape, the physical fact of him filling space in a way that was meant to communicate something. He was used to that communication landing. He was used to the intake of breath that happened when he walked into a frame, the stillness that meant awareness of proximity to something above the scale of normal threat. Luffy was watching him the way he'd watched the food truck Crane, with interest but not alarm. "You've been a problem." Homelander's voice had the measured quality of someone choosing not to use a different tone. "Your company locks people in boxes and takes them to sea," Luffy said. "You're on signs all over this city. You knew. That's a complicated..." "It's not. Very flat. You knew and you let it happen. You're the one from the signs." Homelander's jaw moved. He had a response. Several responses, actually. He'd fielded versions of this conversation before, and he knew exactly how to navigate it. The right amount of controlled indignation, the pivot to national security, the reframe around institutional complexity. The machinery was there. It didn't engage. Because the person in front of him wasn't trying to score points, or win an argument, or expose him. The person in front of him had just stated a thing he believed to be true and was waiting to see if there was a reason to change the assessment. There wasn't a position to counter. There was just a fact sitting on the rooftop between them. He had never been on this side of that kind of conversation before. "You're not afraid of me," Homelander said. "Should I be a beat long enough to count?" "Yes," Homelander said. Luffy thought about this with the brief, genuine consideration he gave most things. "Okay, tell me why." Homelander opened his mouth and found for the first time in longer than he could trace back that the answer was harder than the question. Below them on the east side of the street, Annie caught Ryan at the bottom of the stairwell. He was still wearing the jacket Homelander had picked. He looked at her once, then at the building behind him, then back at her. "He told me to find you," Ryan said. "I know." She put a hand on his shoulder, not adjusting just there. "Come on." On the roof, the camera crew had begun quietly dismantling their setup because the shoot was clearly not happening and equipment left on rooftops invited questions. Derek had retreated to the stairwell access and was sending a message to someone whose response he was dreading. Luffy and Homelander stood on the empty roof with the city below them, and the crane shadow moving slowly across the cleared street. And neither of them was finished, and both of them knew it. Butcher got the field report from Huey at 6 that evening, sitting in the fishing camp with a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. "Ryan's with Annie." Huey's voice was tired. "He's okay. Quiet, but okay." "And Homelander? Still on the roof when we left. Luffy was still there too." Butcher turned the mug in his hands. "They didn't fight," he said. "No, just talked, if you call it that." A pause. "Luffy told him his company puts people in boxes." Homelander didn't have a response. Butcher set the mug down. Outside, the camp's dock light had come on automatically, throwing a yellow stripe across the dark water. He had spent 11 years building a case against a system that protected itself by being too large to confront directly, too embedded to pull out cleanly, too visible to attack without consequences, and too protected to damage through normal means. He had never once considered that the thing most likely to crack it would be someone who didn't understand the system at all. "He's going to come at us hard now, personally. I know. We need to be somewhere defensible." "I know," Huey said. Another pause. "Huey?" "Yeah." "The kid, Ryan." Butcher stared at the dock light. "Make sure he doesn't go back." The refinery sat 8 miles south of the city on a flat stretch of industrial land that smelled like sulfur and money. A cluster of towers and blistered tanks and interconnected pipelines that processed crude into something useful and generated as a byproduct. A constant low roar that locals had stopped hearing years ago. At night, it looked like a small city that had decided against windows. Amber lights on every surface flare stacks, burning off excess, the whole complex outlined in orange against a sky that never fully went dark this close to the Gulf. Butcher had picked it as a fallback position 3 days ago, partly for the access roads, mostly because it was the kind of place where a very large noise would not immediately attract the kind of attention that required explanation. He had not anticipated that the noise would be Homelander. He should have. They'd been there 4 hours when the perimeter alert tripped a motion sensor Butcher had wired to the east fence. Basic, nothing fancy, the kind of thing that flagged deer as often as people. But the reading was not a deer. The reading was a single contact moving at altitude, descending fast. "He's alone," Annie said, watching the tablet. "He doesn't need company," Butcher told her. In the corner of the operations trailer they'd commandeered, Ryan sat with his back against the wall and his knees up, very still in the way he'd been still since the parking structure. Not asleep, just waiting for whatever came next, with the patience of someone who had learned that whatever came next usually came regardless. Luffy was outside. He had been outside for the past hour, sitting on top of a brine tank with a bag of chips he'd found in the trailer's break room, watching the flare stacks. He found them interesting. He had said so twice. Huey went to the door, opened it. "Luffy?" "I see him," Luffy said without turning around. The figure coming down through the amber-lit sky was moving with the controlled deceleration of someone who wanted to be seen arriving. Not just arriving, the descent timed for maximum visual impact, Hape catching the updraft from the nearest flare stack, the whole approach engineered for a specific impression. Luffy watched it. He does that a lot. The entrance thing, yeah? He ate a chip. Theatrical. Tank. Homelander landed 40 feet out on the access road between 2 tank clusters and stood in the gap with the orange light behind him, doing exactly what he'd calculated it would do. He had not come in a Vought vehicle. No team, no camera crew, no PR apparatus. Just him, the cape, and the very deliberate decision to make this personal. "I want the boy," he said. His voice carried easily across the 40 feet. He hadn't raised it. Luffy dropped off the tank, landed on the gravel without ceremony, still holding the chip bag. He looked at Homelander, then at the space around him, the tanks, the pipelines, the catwalks, above the distances, the automatic inventory. He ran on every place he stood in, not tactical planning, just presence. "He's not going," Luffy said. "That's not a conversation I'm having with you." "Ryan." Luffy raised his voice slightly toward the trailer without looking back. "You want to go?" A beat. From inside the trailer, "No." Luffy looked back at Homelander. Shrugged very slightly, the gesture of someone who has checked and confirmed a thing. Homelander's jaw set. He had prepared for a number of openings. This had not been one of them. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said. "You've been lucky. The things you've hit A-Train was running on a damaged heart. The Deep is a liability we were phasing out anyway. The staging operation you disrupted was a Tier 2 asset. You haven't hit anything real yet." Luffy tilted his head. "Your people put them in boxes and sent them to sea." He ate another chip. "You knew. You're standing here telling me I haven't hit anything real." A beat. Okay. "I'm trying to understand what you think that means." Something shifted behind Homelander's eyes. Not anger exactly. Anger was easy. Anger was a known quantity. This was the deep frustration of a man whose framing kept not landing, whose usual levers were finding no purchase, and it was producing something that looked like anger, but ran deeper. He moved. Thumbed. At full speed, Homelander covered 40 feet in a time that didn't register as duration. One moment he was standing in the gap between the tank clusters. The next moment, he wasn't, and the impact that followed went through Luffy and through the access road gravel and through the base of the nearest tank before it stopped a sound like a controlled demolition metal screaming against metal, the whole tank cluster shuddering on its footings. Dust. The smell of stressed steel. A pipe somewhere above, spraying something that caught the flare light and turned orange. Luffy came out of the tank base, feet first, pulling himself free of the dent. He rolled his shoulder, checked his hat, which had survived. "Okay," he said. That was real. He exhaled steam, faint rising from his skin in thin threads, and when he moved toward Homelander, this time he moved differently. Not faster, not yet, but with the quality of something that had been mostly idle and was now paying attention. Gears second. The words were barely a murmur, more notation than announcement. Homelander's heat vision came in a line narrow and surgical, aimed at the center of mass. Luffy was 3 feet to the left of where it hit, having moved in the window between the targeting and the beam, and the pipeline behind him took the shot instead and ruptured with a sound like a gunshot and a gout of pressurized gas that ignited immediately on contact with the nearest flare. The fireball lit the eastern side of the complex, orange-white. From the trailer doorway, "Get Ryan to the west exit," Butcher said to nobody in particular, to everyone in earshot. Annie was already moving. Homelander went for the trailer. Not fast, deliberately at the pace of someone making a point. He had calculated correctly that the people in the trailer were the ones Luffy would not want hit. He had calculated also correctly that the fastest way to split Luffy's attention was to make him choose between the fight and the people behind him. He had not calculated Luffy getting there first. The arm that wrapped around his torso came from behind and from the left, and covered the distance from the ruptured pipeline to his position in a fraction of a second. And the redirect that followed was not a block. It was a change of direction. His own momentum being borrowed and returned at a different angle. And the tank he hit was larger than the first one and did not have the structural tolerance for that kind of contact. He hit it twice. The second time was Luffy. Gomu Gomu no Culverin. The punch bent mid-trajectory, tracking Homelander through his evasion, curving around the pipe cluster he'd tried to use as cover. And the impact drove him through the tank wall and out the other side and into the catwalk structure, above which came down in sections. Homelander was up before the catwalk finished falling. His suit was intact. His face was not. The expression he wore was one that almost nobody ever saw. Not in public, not on camera, because it was the expression that happened when the math came out wrong and the ego hadn't caught up yet. He fired the heat vision again, broader this time, sweeping, burning through a row of secondary pipelines and the control station behind them and the catwalk supports on the west side. And the roar that followed was the sound of the West Processing Wing deciding it no longer wanted to be upright. "Fire suppression is down." Huey's voice on the radio, very controlled. "The whole west cluster is compromised." Luffy was on the catwalk above the catwalk that hadn't fallen, the eastern section still up. He looked at the burning west wing. At the civilians, Homelander had just endangered 2 refinery workers who'd been sheltering in the control station and were now running from it. He looked at Homelander. "You meant to hit them. You care about them." Homelander had risen back to 10 feet, hovering, putting the elevated position between them. His voice had shifted colder, the managed effect peeling back to something that didn't need management because it had stopped caring about the impression it made. "Then maybe stop. Let me take Ryan. Let me walk out of here and nothing else burns tonight." Luffy's answer was to jump. He hit Homelander from below, both hands. The bazooka driving him upward, out of the hover, and into the open air above the complex, away from the tanks, away from the pipelines, away from anything that could be used as leverage. The sky above the refinery was empty, except for the 2 of them, and the smoke rising from the west cluster, and in that empty space, there was nothing to hide behind and nowhere to redirect the damage. Snake Man. The steam was heavier now, the air around him warmer, and the next 3 impacts went places Homelander didn't expect. Changing angle between throw and arrival, the curvature impossible, to read the black mamba looping around his guard and finding the side of his face and the ribs and the shoulder in 3 hits that arrived as one continuous consequence. Homelander dropped 6 feet before he caught himself. He hung there in the air above the burning refinery cape, framing him the orange light from below. Catching the damage on his face, the cut above his eye from the catwalk, the bruising already visible along his jaw. The asymmetry that shouldn't have been possible on a face that had been photographed 10,000 times from every angle, and had never once looked like this. He looked down at the figure on the eastern catwalk. Not at the hat, not at the scar, at the eyes. The eyes that were watching him with the same quality they'd had since the parking structure roof, since the first time they'd been in the same room. The eyes that had never in any context for any duration held the thing Homelander required. He opened his mouth. He had something to say, something about this not being over, about what came next, about the mistake being made here. The machinery was available. It didn't engage. He looked at the burning west cluster, at the smoke rising from the compromised pipeline, at the 2 refinery workers who had made it to the access road and were very far away and very safe, which was not what he had intended when he'd swept the heat vision through that section. He looked back. "This isn't done," he said. "I know," Luffy said. Homelander turned. He rose. He left, not fast enough to be running, just fast enough to be leaving, which in the arithmetic of tonight amounted to the same thing. The west cluster burned for 40 minutes before the automatic suppression on the adjacent section kicked in and contained it. The 2 refinery workers had called emergency services from the access road. By the time the first truck arrived, the people in the operations trailer were 3 miles east on a county road with no lights on. Ryan sat in the back seat between Annie and Huey and looked at the orange glow on the horizon where the refinery was. He watched it for a long time without saying anything. It was the color of the flare stacks Luffy had been watching when Homelander came down. He wondered if Luffy had still been watching them when his father left. "Is it always like that?" Ryan said. "No," Huey said. "Usually it's smaller." Ryan was quiet for a moment. He left. Nobody answered. The words sat there, left doing the work of a much longer sentence. Butcher was in the front passenger seat watching the glow. He had said nothing since they'd cleared the perimeter. He had the look of a man recalculating not the numbers he'd expected to run, but different ones, with different variables, producing an answer he hadn't prepared the right response to. In the vehicle behind them, Luffy was eating the remainder of the chip bag. He ran, Butcher said, flat, quiet, not to anyone in the car, just to the dark road ahead of them. The glow on the horizon pulsed once, a secondary ignition. Something finding the last of the fuel in the compromised line and then steadied into the long, low burn of a thing that had already done the damage it was going to do. He actually ran, Butcher said. The concession stand outside Gate C was technically closed. The roll shutter was down. The lights inside were off, and the hand-lettered sign zip-tied to the grate read, "No food service during mandatory assembly." But the lock on the service entrance at the back had not been particularly robust, and the smell of whatever had been cooking in the warming trays that morning was still present enough to follow through a gap in the corrugated siding. Luffy had followed it. He was in the back of the concession stand in the dark, eating a tray of stadium nachos that had been sitting under a heat lamp since 7 a.m. and had achieved a texture best described as architectural. He ate them with the focus of someone for whom the current state of a city in controlled emergency lockdown was relevant but secondary to the current state of the nachos. Outside, through the concrete walls of the stadium approach, he could hear the city, not sirens. The city had moved past sirens into something quieter and more tense. The specific sound of a large number of people being told to stay where they were by a system they were still mostly inclined to trust. The Vought emergency broadcast had been running for 3 hours. It said in various combinations that a dangerous, unregistered individual was being dealt with, that citizens should remain in designated safe zones, and that the Seven were managing the situation. It said Homelander was managing the situation personally. Luffy finished the nachos. He considered the tray. He put it back under the heat lamp in case someone else wanted it later. Outside the service entrance, a food cart had been abandoned in the parking lot, the vendor gone. The cart locked the small, heated cabinet on the front. Still running on its battery, the smell of something involving meat curling out through the ventilation gap. He examined the lock. He left the cart alone. Then he looked at the stadium entrance. He went in. The interior of the stadium had been arranged with care. At one end, the field had been cleared. At the center, elevated on a platform that Vaught's logistics team had assembled in 4 hours, stood Homelander. Behind him, the massive screen running continuous footage of the past week's events, edited into a narrative that was coherent and largely invented. Beside him, Ryan in the blue jacket standing very still. In the stands, approximately 900 people. Not the full capacity, the stadium held 50,000. But 900 was enough, and more importantly, 900 was the number that had been selectively retained when the evacuation was announced. Kept in place without being told, they were being kept guided by Vought security personnel to the sections that had the best camera angles. They sat in clusters, in the lower bowl, lit from below by the platform lighting their faces, visible to the cameras positioned around the field. 5 camera positions, 1 aerial drone, a satellite truck in the parking lot. Butcher had been watching from the upper deck for 40 minutes. He had his phone, his binoculars, and the hard case Annie had given him 3 days ago. Now opened the payment trail from Trisha Vargas's files, uploaded to 6 separate servers, and transmitted to 8 journalists who were not on Vaught's preferred media list. He had done that 45 minutes ago, before the stadium. He had then climbed the stairs to the upper deck and watched. "He's going to use Ryan to anchor the speech," Annie said in his earpiece. She was at the East Service Tunnel 2 levels down with Huey. "Ryan's not restrained. He could walk off." "He won't," Butcher said. "Not with that many cameras. Kid thinks walking off makes it worse for the people in the stands." A beat. "Is he wrong?" "Probably not." He adjusted the binoculars. "Where's Chiu?" "Gate C concession. He's been in there for 20 minutes. Butcher looked at the field. At Homelander standing on the platform with the posture of a man, rehearsing something he'd practiced 1,000 times. At Ryan standing to his left, doing nothing with the specific quality of someone who had decided doing nothing was the safest available action. "He's going to start," Butcher said. "Research." Homelander tapped this microphone once. The sound filled the stadium, not loud, just present a reminder that the infrastructure worked and he controlled it. He let the silence settle. He was good at silences. He had learned that a silence properly held did more work than almost any sentence. I want to be honest with you," he said. The screen behind him switched to a photo, the ship offshore, the Coast Guard vessels, the hole in the hull. "This happened. 7 days ago, something boarded one of our vessels and attacked our people." He paused. "I'm not here to tell you it didn't happen. I'm here to tell you it's been handled." A murmur through the 900. Exactly the murmur he'd calibrated for. There are forces in this world that don't respect what we've built. Forces that don't understand or don't care what it cost to make this country safe. He moved slightly, the cape catching the platform light. "My son is here tonight. because I want you to understand something about what we're protecting. This isn't about me. This is about what comes after me." Ryan did not move. He was looking at the space above the far stand, the dark upper tier of the stadium where the cameras didn't reach. Something was there. None. Luffy had come in through the upper deck access, which was unlocked because nobody had anticipated anyone wanting to get into the upper deck of a stadium being used as a controlled assembly venue. He stood at the rail, one hand resting on the concrete edge, and looked at the field, the platform, the screen, the 900 people in the lit sections of the lower bowl, the 5 cameras, the drone which he had noticed as soon as he came through the door. He looked at Ryan. Ryan was looking back. Homelander was still talking. He had good rhythm, the pauses in the right places, the weight distributed correctly across the sentences, the face doing the thing faces were supposed to do to communicate sincerity. Everything was calibrated. Luffy watched it for about 30 seconds. Then he looked at the 900 people in the stands, who had been moved there by people they trusted to follow a process they didn't fully understand and who were now sitting in camera optimal positions while a man on a platform told them they were being protected. He put both hands on the rail and vaulted it. The drop from the upper deck to the lower was 40 feet. He landed on the concrete of the aisle between sections 7 and 8 with a sound like a piston firing. And the 900 people in the lower bowl turned at the sound, and the cameras turned, and Homelander stopped mid-sentence. Luffy walked down the aisle toward the field. He still had a trace of nacho cheese on his left hand. He wiped it on his cardigan. "Duh, get these people out," Annie said in the service tunnel to Huey. "East and west exits, now." "Vault security, is it both?" "I know." She was already moving. "Go." And yet, Homelander stepped off the platform. He did not fly. He walked down the steps, measured the cape very still, because walking communicated control, and he needed control right now more than altitude. "You're interrupting something," he said. Luffy kept walking. "Let them go. They're not prisoners. They didn't choose to be here." He stopped at the field boundary, the line between the stands and the grass. "You moved them. I saw the reports. They were told to stay." "That's let them go. And then we can talk about whatever this is." He gestured at the platform, the screen, the entire arrangement. "Or don't, and then we skip the talking." Behind Homelander, Ryan had stepped to the edge of the platform. He was looking at Luffy. Not at the cameras, not at his father. At Luffy the way someone looks at the one fixed point in a room that's tilting. Homelander looked at the cameras. 2 of them had pivoted to cover the new situation. That was either a problem or an opportunity. He had maybe 30 seconds to decide which. He had not in his entire career been given an ultimatum by anyone who was not himself. Or a boardroom he had subsequently made understand its error. He decided it was an opportunity. "You want them to leave?" He stepped forward very close now, close enough that the size difference was visible to every camera in the venue. "Then make them afraid. Give them a reason to run." He smiled the calibrated smile the one focus groups had rated as strong but approachable. Because right now, they're watching. And what they're watching is going to define what they remember. "What do you want them to remember?" Luffy said. "That I handled this." Luffy looked at him, then at the 900 people in the lower bowl, very quiet now, very still. Then back. "They're watching you tell a kid to stand on a stage, Shindan," he said. "They're watching you keep 900 people in a building after you told the city to evacuate. They're watching you do this." He gestured again, the whole arrangement, and call it protection. He turned to the stands, just turned and looked directly the way you look at someone when you have something to say to them specifically. "You can leave us tonight," he said. Not loud, conversational. "The east and west exits are open." People began to move. Homelander's heat vision came in a line aimed at the aisle. Not at Luffy, at the people moving through it, a warning shot 6 inches above their heads that cut through 2 rows of seating and ignited the foam padding and made the message very clear. They stopped. "Stay," Homelander said. The conversational register was gone. Luffy's attention had not moved from the burning seats. The fire was small. The fire suppression in the stadium's system would hit it in 40 seconds, and the seats were above the evacuation path, and nobody had been hurt. But the line had been in the air for about a 1/10 of a second before it hit the seating, and in that 1/10 of a second, it had passed approximately 3 feet above a woman in the front row of Section 8 who had a child on her lap. He had seen it. Gear 5th. The steam came fast. Not thin threads like Gear 2nd, but a wave of it, the air around him warming and shifting, the quality of the space around him changing in a way that was difficult to name precisely, but registered immediately. The straw hat lifted slightly in the updraft and settled. He moved toward Homelander, and the first exchange was so fast that the camera operators tracking it later would describe it as a cut between frames. Homelander, their contact. Homelander somewhere else. The platform shattered, where the impact had redirected through it. What followed was not a fight in any recognizable sense. Homelander was very strong. He was very fast. He had fought his way through situations that would have ended anything else, and the power he brought to the stadium field was real and enormous and not nothing. None of it mattered in the proportion he was accustomed to it mattering. Luffy's movements had the quality of weather, not fast, exactly not slow, just present wherever consequence required, and absent everywhere else, the geometry of each exchange bending in directions that Homelander's instincts trained on everything that had ever come at him before could not anticipate. He threw heat vision, and it found empty air. He went for altitude, and something pulled him back down, not by force alone, but by the peculiar physics of an arm that didn't follow the rules. Arms were supposed to follow wrapping around him, at a distance that shouldn't have been possible. He went through the sponsor wall at Section 12, through the VIP barrier at the south end, through the main screen, which was very large and very expensive, and came down in sections the footage of the ship and the curated narrative, and the Vought logo fragmenting into pieces across the field. He caught himself before the third impact with the North Concourse wall. Hovered. The cape was torn at one edge. His face had the asymmetry from the refinery, now worse a cut above the left eye bruising along the jaw that was dark enough to see from the stands. 900 people were still in the building. Some were crouched behind seats. Some were at the exits, which Annie and Huey were now holding open from the outside. Some were filming on their phones, which would be the footage that lasted. Homelander looked at his hands, at the field, at the cameras, 3 of which were still running. He looked at Ryan, who was still on the platform edge, watching with the expression of someone doing a calculation that was going to take a long time and was already starting to come out wrong. "Ryan," Homelander said. Ryan didn't move toward him. Homelander's face did something then, not a breakdown, not a collapse, just a shift. The performed version of himself. The one with the strong jaw and the calibrated sincerity dropped for approximately 2 seconds. And what was underneath it was something older and rawer and more honest, which was also more frightening. "You're mine," he said. Quiet. Not for the cameras. Just true. Ryan looked at him for a moment. Then, no. One word. Very quiet. Very final. Homelander looked at the remaining cameras, at the people filming on their phones, at the 900 witnesses and the satellite truck in the parking lot, and the 6 servers Butcher had uploaded to 45 minutes ago. He went for Luffy. The final exchange lasted 11 seconds. Homelander committed fully everything he had, every reserve, the heat vision and the speed and the weight of everything he'd ever been and everything that had ever feared him. And it landed, and it was real. And it drove Luffy back 6 feet before he planted. Then Luffy hit him back. Not an elaborate technique, not a named sequence. Just both arms full extension, the acceleration of a stretched rubber band releasing at the point of maximum tension, the impact going through Homelander's chest, and through the stadium air, and through the noise, and through 900 people watching, and through every camera that was still recording. Homelander crossed the length of the field. He went through the opposite sponsor wall. He came to rest in the debris of Section 31, in the dark part of the upper tier where nobody was sitting. And the concrete around him had cracks in it in a pattern that radiated from the point of impact. He was alive. He was not standing. He was not, for the first time in his adult life, in a position to do anything about the situation he was in. And the situation he was in was being watched by every camera still running in the venue, and through those cameras by every person in the country who had access to a screen. The field was very quiet. Luffy stood at the center of it, hands at his sides, steam dissipating around him in slow curls. His hat was on. His cardigan was intact. He looked at the section where Homelander had come to rest. And then at the stands, and then at Ryan still on the edge of the platform. He walked over to the platform, held up a hand. Ryan looked at it for a moment, then took it and stepped down. They found Butcher in the upper deck. He was still at the rail, binoculars down, watching the field below where Annie and Huey were moving people toward the exits, and Vought security personnel were very carefully choosing not to do anything that would make the next 30 minutes worse for themselves. "He's not dead," Butcher said. "I know," Huey said. "Could have been." "I know." Butcher was quiet for a moment. His hands were on the rail. Below them on the field, Luffy had found something, a pretzel. A stadium pretzel, apparently left on a seat by someone who'd been evacuated and was eating it while walking toward the tunnel. "He's not going to stay," Butcher said. "No. Doesn't want anything from this." "No." Butcher looked at the section where Homelander was. The cracked concrete, the debris, the cameras still running. 30 years, he said. 11 years of that specifically. And the thing that cracks it is a kid who just wanted lunch. Huey didn't have an answer for that. Neither did Annie, who had come up the stairs and was standing 2 steps behind them. They stood there and watched the field empty out. Luffy came out of the stadium through Gate C, which was where he'd come in. The food cart in the parking lot was still there, still running, still locked. He examined the lock again. He left the cart alone again. He looked at the parking lot, at the street beyond it where the city was beginning the process of understanding what had just changed. At the sky, which was the flat pre-dawn gray of a night that had been very long and was almost done. Ryan was behind him, still in the jacket. He had not let go of the pretzel Luffy had given him during the tunnel walk, and he was holding it like he'd forgotten it was there. "Where are you going?" Ryan asked. Luffy considered the street. "There was a place with good brisket, east. That's 12 miles? I walk fast." Ryan looked at the pretzel, at the stadium behind them, at the street Luffy was already moving toward. "The thing you said. In the parking structure." He paused. "About doing what you wanted." Luffy stopped, turned back half a turn the way he'd done on the dock when the boy from the ship had asked if he was coming. "Yeah. Do you actually do that? Just go where you want?" Luffy thought about it, the brief, honest consideration. Mostly. Sometimes people need something first. Ryan was quiet for a moment, turned the pretzel in his hands. He said, "You're mine." I heard. He meant it. I know. Does that... Ryan stopped. Started again. Does it stop being true if he said it? Luffy looked at him. Direct, uncomplicated, the same quality of attention he gave everything that mattered. He's saying it doesn't make it true, he said. You going where you want is what makes it not true. Ryan stood in the parking lot for a moment with that. Then Luffy turned back to the street and kept walking. And somewhere behind him, in a building that would spend the next several months being very carefully not discussed at certain levels of American government, a man in a torn cape lay in the dark of Section 31, with cameras still running, and the footage was already everywhere, and there was nothing left to manage. Annie caught up with Ryan in the parking lot. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on his shoulder, not adjusting just there the same way she had at the stairwell. They walked to where Huey had the car. Butcher came out last. He stood at the Gate C entrance and looked at the empty parking lot and the street beyond it and the specific shade of the sky that meant morning was coming, whether anyone was ready for it. He looked at the food cart. He looked at the direction Luffy had gone. He went to the car. Sent 12 miles east as the sun came up over the flat Louisiana horizon, a brisket place that had been closed since the city's emergency lockdown began. Unlocked its front door because the owner had been watching the stadium footage on his phone since 3 a.m. and had concluded that the emergency was probably over. He went to turn on the smoker. The bell above the door rang. He looked up. "You're open," said a voice that was very familiar in the way that things seen on very bad nights from a great distance are familiar. The owner looked at the straw hat, at the cardigan, at the expression of someone for whom the past 12 miles had been very straightforward, and the next part of the day was also very straightforward, and who needed to know if the smoker was on. He turned it on.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.